This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Abam, welcome everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Bruchim Abam to the Kollel Agra de Perka, Monday afternoon, National Shiur. Today's learning should be a Eloi Nishmas, Chaya Chana Bas Chaim Mordechai, whose yahrzeit is tomorrow. We're continuing in the subject of visiting Spain, living in Spain. A week from tomorrow, I have the opportunity to speak on a trip to España, to Spain, to Amsterdam, to Portugal. And we began discussing this topic. So next Monday, the next 2 Mondays, there will not be Shiur. So in 1968, we discussed last week, permission was given by the Franco government for a repair of a ancient shul in Madrid, and the question was therefore raised about whether settlement and visiting Spain is authorized. We quoted an article in the Kislev Teves edition of Hamar, 1969, and the author says that following the Spanish expulsion, rabbinic authorities of that generation placed a ban for any Jew to establish residence there, and it is alleged that that ban was promulgated for 400 years, but then was later accepted by later generations as a decree. And because this prohibition has been accepted by all of Klal Yisrael, so Ein Bezdin Yachal Levatel Divrei Bezdin Chaveroi Elam Kein Gadol Mimeno B'Chachma U'B'Minyan. We cited the letter of Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, that he says that there is no source for a Cherem not to live in Spain. There is no shvua. Probably, he says, it's reasonable they were not machmer more than living in Mitzrayim, and they never, perhaps even if there was an Isser, it was only Assered to settle there permanently, and not for the sake of business. For business it was permitted. That was what we learned last week. The Tzitz Eliezer also began a search for what is the basis of this ban, and because there's no authoritative source, at first glance, the Hashkafa Rishayna, the Tzitz Eliezer writes in Chelek Hey Siman Yud Zayin, it would seem that it cannot be prohibited, especially because there were many Gedolim who recorded their personal history, a Spanish Gedolim, and nothing of this sort is recorded. However, the Tzitz Eliezer says that after further consideration, he says he's very concerned for something called Koil Dolai Pasuk, which is Kekal Shakai. Tzitz Eliezer says the traditional attitude of the Jewish people has always been that we're not allowed to go back, and therefore we should apply the rule Hanach Lohen Li Yisrael Eina Neviim Hein B'nei Neviim Hein. If there's a certain attitude among the Jewish people, there's basis for that. And Tzitz Eliezer therefore said one cannot easily permit an establishing settlement in Spain. And when he asked the Rishon LeZion Rav Ben Sion Uziel if he knows of any source, he says there's no makar, but it's a tradition, ish mi piish, that Sfardim are makbid from time immemorial, not to violate the haskama that is accepted. And he knows that although there are a few Sfardim that live in Spain, every time they make a petition to that we should send them a Rav, no clergy wants to go to Spain. So that strengthens the attitude, says the Tzitz Eliezer, that Lamaisa we can't be matter this. Furthermore, we know that the historic name Toledano, as reported in the Sefer Ner Ma'aravi, the Toledano was 45 generations of Chachamim, and in 1492, Rav Yosef and his son Rabbi Daniel left Toledo. Rabbi Daniel was Rosh Chachmei Castilla, and we mentioned Toledano is a compound word for Toledo. No, we ain't ever going back there. Furthermore, let's progress. The Tzitz Eliezer brings a tshuva of the Maharit, where the Tzitz Eliezer quotes a tshuva of the Maharit very interestingly, where the Maharit says, let's see if we can find it here. Basically, that Hu Yadua, and this is quoted back in the Tzitz Eliezer, again in Chelek Kesim Yud Zayin, he says, look where my cursor is, we're on the 7th page of the Mar Makoimos. He says, Hu Yadua, ki la'olam lo yavoi shum Italiano shaholach la'argon, v'noilad sham, hu va'aviv, ki ein sham Yehudi ba'argon ze shivim shana. No Jew lives in Aragon for 70 years. Not only that, va'anu betuchim, we are confident shlo yehal oid sham Yehudi. No Jew will ever again live in Aragon. Ki hakel yisbarach, because the Almighty who mekabetz nidchei Amo Yisrael. La'aretz Yisrael, B'zman Karov, we have faith that God will redeem the Jewish people to the land of Israel very shortly. So this seems to indicate the Maharit lived in the aftermath of the Inquisition, and he says no Jew lives in Aragon now for 70 years, and we're sure that no Jew will ever again go back to Aragon. So says the Tzitz Eliezer, why do you think no Jew lived in Aragon for 70 years, and why are we so confident that they'll never return? Obviously it's because there's a consensus, there's a agreement that we should never return to Spain. There must be some kind of cherem or takana that we're not allowed to go back there. And therefore, based on that, the Tzitz Eliezer is very hesitant to give any official recommendation that you could return there. But as we're going to see today, the overwhelming majority of poskim say that it is permitted. And to begin with, this comment of the Tzitz Eliezer that for 70 years no Jew lived in Aragon, and we're confident that no Jew again will live in Aragon. So the Rabbi Vadia Yosef says, if you look carefully, you'll see that not only does that not prove that there is not only does that not prove that there is a cherem, that proves that there is no cherem, because no Jew lived there in Aragon for 70 years, and we're confident no Jew will return. Why? Because God will redeem us. What do you mean? And even if God doesn't redeem us, no Jew will live in Aragon, because there's a cherem that you're not to live in Spain. So why is the Mabit saying that we're confident that no Jew will ever return there? Because the Geula will come. That's not why we're confident. There's a more basic reason. And that reason is we're not allowed to go there. Isn't there a cherem? So if anything, the fact that the Mabit says that we're confident that we'll never return because of the imminent Geula, that implies without the imminent Geula, we could go back there. So if anything, says Rav Vadia, that proves there is no cherem. Furthermore, last week we mentioned from Rav Herzog, who says that Ein shum yisoid bar samach lahaniach shehaya cherem b'zeh me'ez gedol Yisrael. There is no reliable source that there was a cherem from the Gedolim. Therefore, v'alkein ein lehischashev imakol hahu. You don't have to pay attention to this kol. It's interesting. What the Tzitz Eliezer says, that if the Jews are buzzing about something, there must be basis to this. Hanach lehem li Yisrael amenim neviim b'nei neviim. Rav Herzog says, no, it's just gibberish. It's just chatter. And says Rav Herzog, even if there was a cherem, we could be matter it. Why? First of all, the circumstances changed. It's not the same Spain. There's democracy today, there's freedom. So let's begin with this point, that even if there was a cherem, we could be mater the cherem. Again, we mentioned that if there's a suffix about a cherem, it's not so simple we could say suffix d'oraisa, suffix d'rabanan lakula, because a cherem is a d'oraisa, and the Rashba says in a tshuva that violating a cherem is a d'oraisa, and we should say suffix d'oraisa l'chumra. But the question is, if there was a cherem, and it was made by early authorities, is it something that we have the authority to contravene and uproot? So there's a very interesting tshuva from the Truas Melech of Harav Yosef Zusmanovitz. He was the son-in-law of the Rosh Hashiva of Slobodka, Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, and this tshuva was brought to the forefront by Reb Shlomo Warman in his letter to the author of Hamar, and this was he's the son-in-law of Reb Moshe Mordechai Epstein of Slobodka, and he says as follows. He says, regarding the question, is it permitted for Jews to settle in Spain in light of the Cherem? He says, if you look in Shulchan Aruch Siman Reish Chav Ches, there's a din Cheremei Tzibor Nitarim. Charamim of the Tzibor are permitted. And even if we make a Cherem not to be materet, in other words, the halacha is that a Cherem made by the Tzibor, you're allowed to permit the Cherem. And even if they made a Cherem that will never be mutter, you could be materet. And then you could be matter the cherem they made not to permit it. So, says Rabbi Yosef Zusmanowitz, he says, even if there was a cherem, let's say they made a cherem not to matter the cherem, we could matter it. We know there was something called Cherem d'Rabbeinu Gershon, and Rabbeinu Tam came along, and he upheld the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershon, and that you could only matter it with 100 Rabbanim. Why did Rabbeinu Tam have to make this stipulation to the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershon? Why did Rabbeinu Tam have to say not to matter the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershon? Rabbeinu Gershon made a Cherem, so who would be matter it? Apparently, if you needed Rabbeinu Tam to say not to be matter the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon, that means you're allowed to be matter the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon. So Rabbeinu Tam had to make a takana not to matter it unless you have 100 Rabbanim. Now, people mistakenly think the reason why we don't have two wives is because of Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon. It's not true. Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon is not binding. You're allowed to matter a Cherem. The reason we don't have two wives is because Rabbeinu Tam made a takana not to matir the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon unless you have 100 Rabbanan. So now it's a takana. And when it comes to a takana, you can't be mevatel takana unless you're gadol b'chachmo v'minyan than those who made the takana. And who's greater than Rabbeinu Tam? By the way, last year we were talking a lot about Rabbeinu Tam, that Rabbeinu Tam was the greatest of all the Rishonim. That's very important to know. People ask, what difference does it make who the greatest is? It makes a big difference, because since Rabbeinu Tam was the greatest, there's no way to remove the takana that he made to uphold the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon. Now, that means, when it comes to not living in Spain, there's no takana not to live in Spain. It was just a cherem. So now we can be materet. Chermei tzibor nitarim. So now there's no shaila. Are you allowed to go back to Spain? But there's a cherem. Great, there's a cherem. We can be mater a cherem. Furthermore, only those who were exiled accepted upon themselves. Jews in other parts of the world never accepted upon themselves. So the majority of Jews never accepted upon themselves. So even if it was a takana, but it wasn't a takana on all of Klal Yisrael, and therefore a takana that's not on all of Klal Yisrael, you could matter the takana even if you're not gadol mimenu b'chacham u'minyan. Furthermore, says the Truas Melech, even if there was a cherem, maybe they only swore they're not going to live in the domain of King Emmanuel and Queen Isabella. But they never said they're not returning to the country. It's they're not returning to the place governed by those Rishaim. It's like someone who says, I make a kainam, that I'm not going to enter your house. So if the owner dies or he sells it, you're allowed to enter the house. So basically, the Truas Melech finds a number of openings of why it should be permitted in this situation. Number one, a cherem of the tzibur, you're allowed to be matir. It's only allowed to be matir it if there's a takana upholding it. And even if there is a takana upholding it, this is not a takana on Roiv Yisrael. And furthermore, maybe it was only on the land governed by Ferdinand and Isabella, but not on the whole country. Interestingly, there was a notable personality who mattered this outright. None other than the Munkatcher Rebbe, the Minchas Elazar. And the Minchas Elazar says regarding whether there could be Jewish establishment in Spain. And he says the reality is there are many Jewish communities developing because it's not easy to make a livelihood, and they found commerce and other sources of income in Spain. And Minchas Elazar says that he would say b'kayach dehetera that this kayal, this rumor that there's a cherem not to live in Spain, it's not more than a suffix. In other words, it's not more than suffix aser. Because if anything, there are many conclusive proofs that there was no cherem. Proof number one, every single cherem in our history is recorded. Chermei Rabbeinu Gershon, they're all recorded. If you look in Shulchan Aruch, there's a record of the bands of Rabbeinu Gershon. There's a record of the bands of Rabbeinu Tam. There's a record of the bands of Marami Rothenberg. They're recorded. The Noisei Kalim discuss them. Furthermore, the Beis Yosef, he died in the year Shin Lamed Hey, 1575. He died at the age of 87. So if he died in 1575, and he died at the age of 87, that would have made him, that means he was born in 1488. So he makes a cheshbon that he must have been 10 years old at the time of the Inquisition. That doesn't make sense. The dates don't work out because the Inquisition was Reish Nun Ches. Um, 1492. No, some of the dates here are off. But the bottom line is the Munkatcher Rebbe says that the Beis Yosef was something like 10 years old at the time of the Inquisition. He may have been a little bit younger. But be it as it may, he was a little boy at the time of the Inquisition. And why would he not have included information about the Spanish Inquisition and include information that there's a halacha that you can't go back to this accursed, blood-soaked country? Why would the Beis Yosef, who was banished from Spain, have made such have omitted any mention of this cherem? And if you're going to say, well, maybe it's because they were afraid of Christian rule, he says it's very hard to say that in Sfas, the Beis Yosef was afraid to record this because of the power of the Christian world. So, it's not more than a suffix. So you'll say, well, it's a suffix, and cherem is a daraisa, so we should say suffix, daraisa, l'chumra. he says, "Amnam gamim nachmer v'nachzakiu l'safek cherem v'gamim nachmer kamad dechsiv b'paiskim decherem da'iraisa." We know Maharas Sasson says that safek da'iraisa l'chumra by a cherem is only if there is a cherem, and we're not sure if the language of the cherem includes it. However, if we're not sure if there is a cherem to begin with, we don't say safek da'iraisa l'chumra. Not only that, we only say safek da'iraisa l'chumra if there's a suffix in the lashon of the takana. But if it's not mentioned in takana, that's not a safek cherem. And certainly if there was no takana at all, we're mesupik, was there a takana, then we don't say safek da'iraisa l'chumra. So, furthermore, says the Minchas Elazar, there's a question whether we Ashkenazim are even subject to this cherem, because it is well known that the Sephardic world, now I am not 100% sure I agree with this, but it's well known that the Sephardic world, they were exiled to Turkey, to Italy, and to other countries, and therefore they're called Sephardim, as opposed to the Ashkenazim who settled in Ashkenaz in after the Crusades in the year Tatnu. They were not from Spain, so therefore maybe they're not subject to this cherem to begin with. Now that's somewhat questionable. I know that the city that my grandfather was born in Lipna, in Linschitz, the city of his family were originally settled by Spaniards very early on. I know that even people of Lithuanian descent, for example, the Aruch HaShulchan himself, his son writes in the Tar Tamima that even though their name is Epstein, their original name was Benaviste, and they were running out of Spain and they stopped off in the German city of Epstein, and therefore he says that anyone whose name is Epstein is a Levi and is Spanish. Okay, but probably the majority of Ashkenazim were not in Spain, and therefore it's highly unlikely they were ever subject to this cherem. The bottom line is, the Minchas Elazar says, it is permitted for there to be established communities in Spain today. Okay, I want to share with you something else. So, it seems like it's highly questionable whether there ever was such a cherem, and on the other hand, there is no question that even though in all likelihood there was never a halachic ban placed by Gedolei Yisrael, it was definitely something throughout history that people was denigrated and looked down upon. Rabbi Bleich, in his work Contemporary Halachic Problems, he brings that Mr. Tovia Preschel wrote an article in an Israeli newspaper and in a book Hadoar, then the archives of the Sephardic community of Hamburg. So by the way, you see this? The archives of the Sephardic community of Hamburg. Hamburg is in Germany. So you see already in the 17th century there's a Sephardic community in Germany. That's why I said I don't think it's so clear that Ashkenazim are not of Spanish descent. Many Ashkenazim are of Sephardic descent. I mentioned from the Aruch HaShulchan. I know the city my grandfather comes from. It's a Polish city. Rabbi Beryl Wein once said that he has a tradition that his family comes from Spain. But anyway, they have a document. The community adopted a regulation that whoever visits Spain or Portugal, not whoever lives there, anyone who visits Spain or Portugal may not be called to the Torah or honored with any other mitzvah for 2 years. If you take a trip to Spain, you ain't getting an aliyah for 2 years. Professor Cecil Roth, he cites religious sanctions imposed upon visitors to Spain and Portugal, and they were in the regulations of the Chevra of Hachnasas Kala in 1727 in Leghorn, 1785 in the Askamois in London. There were bans placed on visiting Spain. So on the one hand, we don't have any traditional source that there was a cherem not to go to Spain, but we do have clear evidence that it was discountenanced and it was looked down upon, and you would have a hard time being honored publicly if you made the visit. And very likely, here's the explanation. And I think this is really fascinating. Does anybody know? We know the Inquisition went into effect in 1492. Does anybody know what year the Inquisition was disbanded in Spain? It lasted for almost 400 years, 350 years. It was disbanded in 1834. Okay? Which means until 1834, the law was that if a Jew would go back to Spain, they would either be, according to the law, it doesn't mean it was observed, they would either be rightfully killed or forcibly converted. Okay? For almost 350 years. So it's suggested by in an article in Talpios. This was written by Professor Abraham Shalom Yehuda, that in fact there was never a cherem. There was no official cherem. However, if you study the text of the Spanish expulsion issued by Ferdinand Isabella, we'll read it. It states that any Jew found in Spain after the stipulated date of expulsion would be obliged to convert to Christianity or suffer death by hanging. So any Jew who wanted to visit the country would either have to give up his life, forcibly convert, or pretend to be a Christian. Now, is it permitted for a Jew to pretend to be a Christian? No, it's asur. So there was never a cherem, you're not allowed to go to Spain. It was just, the law was that a Jew could not return to Spain. If he did, he would either have to be forcibly converted or suffer death by hanging. So the only way to make the visit is to pretend to be a Christian. But the halacha says you're not allowed to pretend to be a Christian. So there was no cherem, you're not allowed to go back to Spain. The halacha precluded a Jew from returning to Spain because the only way to do so was to pretend to be a Christian. But in 1834, when the Inquisition was disbanded, and now a Jew could return without pretending to be a Christian, so then of course it's permitted to return to Spain. So it comes out the Spanish Inquisition is a halachic document. It's a document that prohibits Jews from going to Spain. But when it was disbanded in 1834, so now it becomes permitted again. So that explains why we have no record of a cherem not to return to Spain. We don't need a cherem. It's a simple halacha. Isabel and Ferdinand issued a decree that a Jew cannot return unless they convert, or they're hung, or they're hanged. So the only way to go back is to pretend to be a Christian. So that you're not allowed to do, and that halacha precludes us from going back. Let's read that. Inyan HaCherem Neged Sfarad. This is Maramakav number 18. Haya Mechadesh L'Shayla Ba'eres. It brought to the forefront an innovative question, Asher Hasikas Rabbanim HaCharedim, that occupied the rabbis, Befrat, in Poland and in Hungary, when the what happened was in 1934, the Jewish community was honored in memory of the Rambam's 800th birthday, and And then he brings that he was invited to Spain in 1913 to hear lectures about the Spanish Gedolim, about their poetry and their achievements. So the question was raised about whether it was permitted to go back. Some rabbis rebuked me, he said, that I accepted the position. He said even though they conceded that was a big Kiddush Hashem to support the new Spanish government that they were trying to repent, nevertheless, how could you go back to Spain when there was a Cherem? He brings that regarding the being mevatel, the Isser was nisbatel me'elav, because the government themselves invited Jews back to Spain and to settle the land, and they allowed me to open up the Bate Knesiyos in Madrid and Barcelona in 1917. But what about the Cherem? He says, if you look in the writings of all the Gedolim who lived then, whether the Abarbanel, the Balo Akeda, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Moshe Alshich, right? The Alshich also was lived in Spain. I asked the rabbis in Morocco who have a tradition about the Spanish Inquisition, and they couldn't tell me anything clear. I asked the rabbi of Tetuan, Rav Yonah, who was in 1914, over 90 years old, and he was a baki in the Shalsachus of the Sfardim. He says he remembers when he was a kid that the rabbis were not pleased with people who went to Spain for business. However, he says, when they needed butchers in Spain, he didn't hear any protests if people wanted to go to shecht in Spain. So therefore he says like this, he looked carefully at the language of the Spanish Inquisition that Ferdinand Isabel wrote, and he says, V'ya'uru einai, and he saw there it was written, V'chein anachnu goizrim u'metzuvim shekalish v'isha gadol aikatan, who's called a Yisrael, should be banished from all of these places. Whoever rebels against us, not to leave on the intended date, August 2nd, 1492. Achas dasai lamos, to be hanged on a tree or to be forcibly converted. So that is clear to me. There was no cherem not to go to Spain. The Isser, it was memela, chal on every Jew, an Isser, because the only way to go there is to pretend to be a Christian so that you would not be caught and killed or forcibly converted. So the Rabbanan never made a cherem. What do you make a cherem for? You need a cherem when they're going to kill you? That's much more chamor than a cherem. So as long as the Inquisition was in effect, it was halachically usher for any Jew to go back. However, when we were freed from the chains of the Inquisition, 1837, according to some 1834, so then it was permitted to return. So the bottom line is that most poskim and most authorities say that there was never a cherem. But the actual prohibition of devolved upon anyone who wanted to go there, because there's no way to go there unless somebody pretended to be a Christian. I want to analyze one more halachic point here, and that is, can the Chachamim impose a ban on the community today, after the seal of the Gemara? Is it within their power? Is it within the power of the Chachamim to impose a ban on the community? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'dvarei. he says, could they be machar as a cherem? Let's say we can't go back to Germany. He says, look, the truth is, from a political perspective, from a moral perspective, it makes a lot of sense. After the terrible atrocities that they perpetrated there, even without the Rabbanon proposing anything, why would a Jew want to go back and step on that accursed land? But, says the Kol Mavasara, Meshulam Rata, he says, I feel obligated to bring to people's attention that for the rabbis to proclaim a cherem is not correct mitzad hadin. It's against the halacha for two reasons. Number one, in our generation, we don't have the capacity to make a new Isser on all the Jews in the world. The Russian Masechta Shabbos over here brings after the sealing of the Shas, the rabbis don't have the capacity to make a gzera. The Shas Tshuvas Rivash, Siman Reish Ayin Aleph, Herech Lachlek Agzeres Maharam Halevi, Rameir Halevi Mevina, who made a gzera on the kilos of Tzarfas. And the Rivash said, don't pay attention. Only the Nasi of the Sanhedrin Gedola, with the Haskama of the Sanhedrin, all of them or most of them, could make a gzera on all of Klal Yisrael. Either to make a siyag, or lefit sarach hasha, or for whatever reason. But individual chachamim, to gather together, they have no capacity to do that. Lo hayu goyzim gzeras al Kol Yisrael. Maybe for their city, for their community. But nobody else has to abide by their decree. The Chachamim don't have the power to do that. Number two, we find, and number two, not only do they not have the power to do that, they're not allowed to do that. Because the rule is, Ein goizrim gezera ala tzibur elam kein roiv tzibur yachal lamed. You need the majority of the people to be able to abide by it. The Rambam says, Bezdin, who wants to make a gzera, make a takana, they have to think very carefully. Could most of the tzibur abide by it, or not? And ein goizim gzera ala tzibur, and kein roiv hatzibur chalam lamed behen. What about the fact that the Megurashe Sfarad were goizer a cherem? There's no evidence of that. There's no basis for that. There's no Yisoid Neman for that. The fact that the Mabit says that there are no Jews in Aragon for 70 years, if anything, that implies that they are allowed to go back. And all that shows is the Bnei Meguresh Sfarad could be goizer on their Medina. But they can't be goizer on all of Klal Yisrael. And the truth is, today you have communities in Spain. So whether they were allowed to go there or not, that shows that there is no halachic authority for the Chachamim in our generation to make a universal ban. That is no longer, that's no longer within their power, and number two, they should not do that. They should not do that. Okay, the Maskana, let's read the conclusion of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Maskana Dedina. Mutter levaker b'Sfarad. It is permitted to visit Spain. Why? Because it's not clear that there ever was a cherem. So we could rely on the poskim that say that if there's a suffix whether there was a cherem, lahakel. And even according to the Shita suffix cherem lahachmer, it's a svek seika. Maybe there was no cherem, and even if there was, maybe they only made the gezerah on themselves and not on all Jews. And even if they made it on all Jews, maybe only on those who settle there permanently, and not who settle there temporarily. Therefore, says Rabbi Ovadia, when I was invited by King Juan Carlos to visit the community in Madrid, and I inaugurated a yeshiva there, I accepted his invitation, and the king accorded us great honor, and he gave me a very great gift, and it was a big simcha, because it elevated the status of the Jewish community. Now I want to share with you. Rabbi Vadia writes in the Sefer Ma'oran Yisrael, something really astounding, something really amazing. Rabbi Vadia writes that the king asked him a wondrous question. The king asked him, Rabbi, one thing I don't understand. What I don't understand is, you call yourself Sfardim. Sfarad means Spain. It means Iberian. But why would a Jew from Morocco call himself a Sfardi? Why would a Jew from Yemen, who was never in Spain, call himself a Sfardi? A Jew from Iran, from Iraq, from Syria. Why do Jews around the world call themselves Spaniards? They're not Spaniards. What kind of appellation is this? What kind of name is this? This is what the king of Spain, King Juan Carlos, asked Rabbi Vadia Yosef. Now, Rabbi Vadia considered Juan Carlos a very wise and sagacious individual. He, in fact, felt that two brachas should be made on him. Shechalak mikvaydai lebasar v'dam, and shechalak mechachmasai lebasar v'dam. And as Rabbi Vadia paskined in the Shiur Rishon L'Tzion, Rabbi Vadia incorporated both of these brachas into one, and he said, Shechalak mi chachmasai umikvaydai lebasar v'dam. And Rabbi Vadia was astounded by the brilliance of this question, and he gave an even more incredible answer. Rabbi Vadia says that we Jews are only a nation not based on a common land, but rather based on the Torah. Like Rabbi Sadia Gaon says, Ein Uma Seinu Uma Ela B'Torah. And therefore a person's identity is based upon which Chachamim he is connected to. The greatest sage who ever lived in Spain was the Rambam, Maimonides, who was born in 1135. And therefore, the Rambam, who was a Noilad Cordova, who was born in Spain, all those Jews who follow him and accept his authority, whether it's the Jews of Spain, or even the Jews of Morocco, or Syria, or Yemen, even though they were never in Spain, and their ancestors were never in Spain, but because they accept the halachic and Torah authority of the greatest sage who ever lived in Spain, therefore they are forever identified as Sfardim, because they accept the authority of the greatest sage who ever lived, namely, they accept the authority of the Rambam. So, this is some of the ideas about visiting Spain today. In all likelihood, there wasn't really a Cherem. Of course, it was highly discouraged, but in all probability, it was because of the law, which was still in effect until 1834 or 1837. Okay, I wish everyone a wonderful day. The next 2 Mondays, there will not be Shiur. You're welcome to join us Wednesday morning at 10:45. And also this Wednesday night, we have a subject of outstanding proportions. 8:30 Wednesday night. Don't miss how Rabbi Yaakov Sasportis was able to know that Shabtai Tzvi was a fraud. Coming up this Wednesday night. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bracha v'atzlacha. Kol tov.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.